Welcome to derivatives. Let's start with just an introduction of what derivatives are. And the definition is that a derivative is any financial instrument that derives its performance from an underlying asset. For example, you might have a stock, and the derivatives that are most common to stocks are those called options, which you may have heard of outside of this course. So with options, because they're derivatives, if the stock price goes up, then the value of the options go up as well. And likewise, if they go down. So the underlying asset is the stock, and the derivative is, or are, since there are multiple options, the options. This positive relationship, when this stock goes up, the derivatives linked to it go up, have an important implication, and it's the reason why derivatives are used in the first place. Because derivatives are used for risk management. If I have this stock and I'm worried about it falling in value, then the benefit that I can get from having an option on this stock is that, well, we'll go into the detail as to how this works later, but if I own this stock and the stock price goes down, if I buy the right option, I can make sure that this option goes up by as much as this stock goes down by. Because while there are options on this stock that are linked positively, when this stock goes up, this option goes up. Notice that the general definition for a derivative is that any financial instrument that derives its performance from an underlying asset. That can go both ways. The definition means that whatever it is, the derivative is just mirroring whatever the underlying does. And there are options that mirror positively like this, but there are options that mirror negatively like this. It's the magnitude by which these two changes, not the direction, that define what a derivative is. And so for risk management purposes, this type of derivative, this one that goes negative when the underlying goes positive, that's actually a very useful feature. The gains on this derivative, if it goes up when the stock goes down, then the gains on this derivative are used to offset the losses on this stock. And so that the overall position of these two things together, the stock and the derivative on it, ends up experiencing not as big of a loss as if we had just invested in the stock by itself. And while some of these derivatives are quite complex, the concept really is that simple. That's the concept behind risk management. You find something that cancels out or reduces or offsets the losses of the thing that you're concerned about. In this case, it's a stock, and we're using options to do that. But there are a number of different types of derivatives that we'll uncover in detail besides options, and there are a number of different securities besides stocks which have derivatives that can be bought and sold on them. As far as options are concerned, however, in the United States, when we look at equities, stocks, well, these equities are traded on stock exchanges. NYSE, NASDAQ, Amex, you may be familiar with these exchanges already. But there are separate exchanges for trading derivatives. For options, one of the big ones in the United States is the Chicago Board of Trade. Actually, these days it's the Chicago Board of Options Exchanges, CBOE. And like the stock exchanges here, there is a lot of standardization in this exchange for derivatives. That means that, if I want to buy shares of Apple, for example, I can only buy in sizes or round numbers of one share. I mean, I can buy more than that, but I can't buy less than one share. That's a standardized feature of trading equities in equity exchanges. In option exchanges in the United States, there's a similar standardized feature. If I want to buy one option on Apple, that actually gets me exposure or sensitivity to the movements in Apple's stock of 100 shares. So there's this relationship. One option is worth 100 underlying shares of Apple stock. And regardless of what stock you're actually trading, this is a characteristic of trading option derivatives. Now, one key thing to note is that I don't actually buy 100 shares when I buy an option on Apple. In fact, I don't really buy anything related. I don't actually buy Apple stock at all. I'm really just buying the idea that my profit I'll gain or lose according to whatever 100 shares of Apple, whatever that performance is. And so actually, as far as cash outlay, when I buy an option, I only have to deposit a very small amount of cash to get exposure to these 100 shares of Apple. Because I'm not actually buying the Apple shares. Apple stock, maybe $1,000, but to get exposure to 100 shares, it may be only, it depends, but maybe only $200. And so there's a big difference here. And the reason for that is leverage. The amount of exposure that I can get by buying one option on Apple is much greater than the financial exposure I get if I just buy one share of Apple outright. It's the same effect that I'd get as if I were using borrowed money. If I borrowed, $100 to buy shares and I only put down $10 of my own money, my percentage return on that $10 when that share goes up is much higher than if I had only spent my $10 and didn't borrow the money. That's leverage. The effect of leverage magnifies gains or losses, and it's a key characteristic of derivatives. Options, but also other types of derivatives that we'll cover. One of those types of derivatives that we'll cover in more detail are futures and forwards. Forwards are like a cousin of futures, and so we kind of lump them together. With forwards and futures, these are also traded on exchanges. The Intercontinental Exchange, or ICE as it's commonly referred to, is a place in the United States and also Europe where you can go, it's an exchange, to buy and sell futures contracts. Here, with forwards and futures especially, you also put money down. like a deposit. And in the futures world, we call that margin. We'll discuss margin calculations in more detail a little bit later down the road. And I noted that forwards are like a cousin to futures. Forwards are traded. They are derivatives like futures, but they're traded OTC. That means over the counter. That means they're not traded on an exchange. Instead, they're traded between just two parties. Oftentimes, it's a bank and a client, or a bank and another bank. They're just making a customized trade. It's as if you and I made a sports bet or something. That was just a deal between you and I. That's an over-the-counter financial contract, and that's what forwards are. Again, we'll discuss what forwards are and how to calculate them in more detail later on, but for now it's important just to know the difference between OTC, over-the-counter, and exchange traded contracts. Whereas over-the-counter contracts are traded one party to another, exchange traded contracts occur in a centralized location. There's an exchange like NYSE or CBOE for options, and all the parties don't interact with each other, not directly at least. They go to the exchange where all orders are centralized. And in order for this to work, with so many millions of different participants, all the contracts have to be very uniform, standardized, for it to work on an exchange. And that's one key characteristic of exchanges versus OTC contracts. Exchange contracts are very uniform, not customized at all, very standardized. But OTC contracts, they can really be about anything. You can have any degree of customization that you want, as long as you can find someone to take the other side of that trade. So, going back to OTC contracts, one type of contract that's a derivative and is OTC is called a forward contract. Let's define this a little bit further. A forward contract is like this. You've got party A and party B, and today they're deciding about trading something. You know, A wants to buy something from B, B wants to buy something from A, but they don't actually make the trade today. I mean, they agree about the price and all that today, but they're agreeing about delivery or about settling this trade sometime specified in the future. And so A and B might say something like this. B, want to purchase Apple, not today, but I want to purchase it for $1,000 from you, A. Again, not today, but in the future. Let's say 6 months from now. And if A thinks that's a good deal, you know, of course, both sides think that they're getting a good deal. That's how a market works. They agree on the contract today, but they don't actually do anything. They just go and say, hey, okay, I'll see you later. 6 months later is when they actually consummate the deal. And B buys from A for $1,000 the Apple security. This is a forward contract, and that's why it's called a forward contract. The contract is decided today, but settled or finished in the future. And so if we know that this is how a forward contract works, we can then calculate the profit for a forward contract. For B, if they agree to buy Apple at $1,000 today, they agreed today, but they didn't actually, get to buy it until the end of 6 months, we can call this the forward price. That's the price at which they agree today to transact in the future. And let's just call that F. And let's say F sub 0 here because that's today. 0 is today as opposed to 6 months later. So the profit for B depends on what Apple's stock price does over the next 6 months. If the future stock price of Apple rises to $1,500 at the end of 6 months, then this is great for B because B buys, they were buying the forward contract, so the B buys at $1,000, but then they're buying 6 months from now, and look at the price now in the market. Apple is trading at $1,500, and yet they get to buy at $1,000. They're buying it from A. And so it's a good deal for them. In fact, the profit for B is whatever that underlying price is at that time, $1,500, minus the forward price, the price at which they originally agreed to buy at, $1,000. So they made $500. And as a consequence, A lost $500 because they're forced to sell at $1,000, even though if they hadn't agreed to this contract, they could have sold in the open market the stock they owned of Apple for $1,500. So that's one thing about a forward contract is whatever one side gains, the other loses. But let's generalize this formula here for the profit and loss. So for B, remember that they agreed on this forward contract price of $1,000. That's the forward price at the beginning of all this. And they got to sell it for $1,500 because that's what Apple was actually trading on at the finish of this forward contract, 6 months down the road. So that's the price of the underlying at the time of the finish of this contract. Now, we call the underlying, whatever, in this case, it's whatever Apple's stock price is over this time period, at any given time period, we call that S. It stands for spot, but it's another word for underlying. So S is going to change, at any given time during this 6 month period, but at the end of the 6 month period, S is subscripted by this T. This capital T means the end of the period. So this is just a way to kind of generalize the formula for calculating profit for B here, $500. And remember, with a forward contract, whatever the buyer gains, the seller of that forward contract loses. And so if the buyer gained 500, we don't even need to calculate loss for the seller because we know that the seller lost 500. But the key point is that if we're calculating the payoff to a forward contract. We look at the forward price agreed upon at the beginning of the contract, and then we follow the difference between the forward price and whatever the underlying does over that time period. And at the end of this time period for the forward contract, when the two parties agree to finish, we look at what that price is for the underlying at that time. At this time, it's ST. And the difference between what the value is at ST and the original agreed upon forward contract price is the profit for the forward buyer. And so the opposite times -1, or just flip these back, is going to be the profit, or of course, in this case, the loss for the seller. And this is how you price, or how you figure out the profit or loss for a forward contract. Now, there's a related security called a swap. And swaps are like a forward contract in that you do have two parties, A and B, and they're agreeing today about what to transact at, what price, and at some point for delivery some point in the future, just like a forward contract. The difference is that they're not just making an agreement about trading 6 months from now, but today they're also making an agreement about how much to trade and at what price 12 months from now, and so on and so forth, for whatever terms of the swap. The swap is very customizable. So you may have 12 months, you may have 24-month agreements. It can really be anything. But the point is that a swap is just like a forward contract, but in fact it's a series of forward contracts stacked together and decided all at once at the beginning of all this. And so we will figure out the profit and loss to a swap later on in more detail. But conceptually speaking, a swap is really like a bunch of forward contracts stacked together into one single security. Now notice that today, these two participants, they are locking in an agreement, and they're only going to do something they're only going to transact at these specific time periods, these pre-specified time periods. And I want to note that because this is a feature of derivatives that sometimes occur. Specifically, when we talk about options, at this point, let's define two different types of options according to this kind of idea, where you've got this fixed schedule of profit or loss. Because you really have two types of options. One is called an American option, and the other is called a European option. European options are like this, where you decide today to buy an option contract. And that option contract has a specific life, a specific duration, and at the end of that duration, this is when you transact, when you calculate the gain or loss to buying this option. Just similar to how we calculated a gain or loss to a forward contract. But for an American option, it's a little bit different. This derivative, it does have a finite life, but you're allowed to take your profit or loss at any time before expiration of this option. And as a consequence, the prices of American options and European options tend to be different because this can be a valuable consideration. We'll see why in more technical detail later on. By the way, these two options, American and European, they have nothing to do with where these are actually traded. As to why they're called American and European, it has nothing to do with, whether one is traded in the United States or whether one is traded in the broader, region of Europe. It just has to do with this time to expiration and whether it can be transacted on in the interim. Now, the last thing to do for this session is to kind of get a sneak preview of options in terms of how to calculate the payoff and just what they're all about. So with options, whether it's a European or American option, you have options called calls and options called puts. A call is an option that benefits when the underlying rises in value. If it's a call on a stock, if the stock rises, the value of the call goes up. A put is just the opposite. It actually benefits when the underlying falls in value. So in this case, if the stock price rises, the put price falls. But if the stock price falls, then the put price rises. And this relates to our idea that these options can be used to lower risk. Let's start with a call first. You remember how with a forward contract, you had two parties, A and B, and they agreed upon today how much to transact at? It's just that they didn't actually do the transaction until sometime later, called expiration. A option is just like that as well. You agree today about the price you can buy something at. Let's make it tangible and call it Apple stock again. B wants the right to buy Apple stock at $1,000. They agree that today, but they don't agree to finish this transaction until later. The agreed upon price today, that X that you see here, that's called the strike price. It's like they're striking a bargain today about transacting something in the future. Strike price is a term that's specific to options. And so the calculation of a call, profit or loss, to a buyer of a call is pretty similar to that of a forward contract that we looked at. They strike their bargain today, and then the price of Apple, the stock, goes up and down and up and down and up and down, and maybe at the time of expiration, the stock price for Apple is again $1,500. In this case, the value of the underlying, remember that, is denoted by S at time t, at the end of all this, is $1,500. And the strike price hasn't changed. It's still $1,000. And so to calculate the profit for the buyer of this call option, what we can do is look at what they have the right to buy it at, the strike price, and compare that to what ultimately the spot price ended up at. So it's ST minus X again. Here, it's ending up at $1,500, the underlying, and the buyer gets the right to buy it at $1,000. So it's a pretty cool deal for this call buyer. They make $500. And of course, the call seller loses $500. But that's the profit there. But there's one key difference between the profit for an options contract and what you saw for a forward contract. Let's illustrate this by supposing that Apple didn't go up to 1,500, but in another universe, the price of the underlying, the price of Apple stock, actually fell down to 500. So Apple stock price tanked. Sounds like the buyer of this call option is not going to make money because, yeah, they have the right to buy it at $1,000, but why would they do that when they could go and just buy the stock outright in the stock exchange for 500? And in fact, that's true. That doesn't make sense. In this case, the loss is $500. But this is a loss that a buyer of an option wouldn't have to incur. A forward contract, definitely. This would be the loss for the buyer of the forward contract. But for the call option buyer, they have like a special privilege, if you will. For them, the profit is not just the difference between what the price ends up at and what the strike price is. They have this extra special insurance. And in fact, they pay a premium for it. That's a unique feature of a call buyer and a put buyer. They have to pay a premium, whereas a forward contract buyer and a futures buyer, they don't have that. But what the premium gets them is this. They can earn the profit if the price goes up, if ST ends up at 1,500, for example, and their profit is going to be the difference between what they got the right to buy at and what it ultimately ended up at. But if they don't want to take this, for example, if it's a loss here, they don't have to. And instead, they can just walk away and not suffer that loss. Sounds pretty nice, especially compared to a forward contract. The problem is just that you have to pay this upfront cost in an option called a premium. It's like buying insurance, But that means that the payoff for a option buyer is the maximum of either ST minus X, the difference between what it ends up at and what they got the right to buy at. Of course, if that's positive, they're going to take that. That's the maximum amount, or 0. Because if ST minus X is negative, then the bigger number here, the maximum, is going to be 0. Meaning that they just walk away. They're out the premium, sure, but they don't have to suffer that $500 loss. That is a very unique feature in the derivatives world of options compared to all the other types of derivatives out there. Okay, on options, one other thing to cover, the profit or loss of a put. So with a put buyer, they profit if the value of the underlying asset falls. And so the payoff to a put buyer is almost like the opposite of that for a call buyer. You have two parties, A and B. If B agrees today about the right to trade a particular stock today, but to actually do that trade some point in the future, at expiration, then they'll do the trade. But what B is actually doing here, B is locking in not the right to buy with a put, but B locks in the right to sell. They strike a deal about the value of X. It's just that this time X, the strike price, is the price at which B gets the right to sell the underlying asset at the time of expiration. So let's make that clear. Let's say X is $1,000 and we're talking about Apple again. B is saying, hey, I want to be able to sell Apple for $1,000. And if B thinks Apple's going to go to $1,500, then they're not going to take this deal. What's happening is that B thinks they're going to be able to lock in a way where they can sell it for $1,000 then, but they think the price is going to be falling for Apple to $500. So they can sell it at the higher price and close out at the $500. That is, they can sell it for $1,000, even though everyone else can only sell it for $500. So they make an extra $500 here. And the way all that works is when we look at the math for it, let's suppose that Apple's price did eventually, go up and down and up and down, and did eventually go to a value of 500. So B was right. We can calculate the profit for B as the buyer of this put option as being the difference between what they locked in the right to sell it at minus the value of the underlying at the time of expiration. So they got a right to sell it for $1,000, and ultimately it went to 500. So B, the buyer of this call option here, their profit is $500. Now, again, just like the buyer of a call, if the value of Apple, the underlying, didn't go the way, the buyer of this option planned, in this case, the buyer of the put expected the price to fall. But if instead Apple rose to $1,500, you can see the problem just mathematically. If you look at the payoff here, they have the right to sell at $1,000, but if Apple went to $1,500, then there's no way they'd want to sell for $1,000 when it could sell for $1,500 in the open market. And so really they lost $500, but because this is an option and not a future or forward contract, they have the right to walk away from this loss. And so, like the buyer of the call, the profit, the potential payoff for a buyer of a put is either zero, they can walk away, or in this case it's X minus S because they're selling instead of buying. So see the difference? For a buyer of a call, it's the maximum of 0 or S minus X. But for a buyer of a put, it's the maximum of 0 or X minus S. One's a buyer and one's a seller. And in truth, these big picture calculations and these ideas are really what's going to make up this course. If you can understand these calculations, the more sophisticated part is how to apply these to either make extreme profits or to reduce the risk of loss in a bunch of different settings, not just for stocks, but for bonds and for interest rates, and how to manage portfolios with derivatives so that the overall wealth that you have in this portfolio is less likely to fall on a day-to-day basis. That's the big use of risk management and the big reason why we use derivatives.